If you think you've got that loaded up, Aaron, I can probably go ahead and get started.
Yes, let me, we're good. All right.
All right, well, good evening, everybody. I know we've got a group on the call right now, and likely we'll get others trickling in as well. Thank you for joining us this evening for a discussion on 3rd and 4th Streets through downtown Lafayette. If you've been tracking this project, you know about the idea that's under study, which is to consider the conversion of the 2 corridors through downtown from a one-way pattern to a 2-way pattern. And tonight we're here to talk a little bit about the project and give you an update on the progress that we've made since our last public meeting. But first of all, I want to acknowledge not only your presence tonight. We really appreciate you coming out and wanting to learn more about this project, but I also wanted to walk through the agenda and tell you how you can participate. It's obviously a bit of a different process now that we're still unable to meet in person in large groups, but we've been able to effectively participate in these types of video calls to not only share out information, but to gain feedback. And tonight we're going to do that. We're going to invite you to participate tonight and even participate after tonight. So we'll go through how to do that. We'll also talk a little bit about sort of the background and the purpose of the project. And then briefly touch upon the history of the corridors. If you were with us during our last meeting, we went over that in a little more detail. Tonight, we'll just touch upon that. We'll also talk a little bit about our process in terms of how we went through this study, where we are right now, and what we still need to finish up. And then we'll get into some of the recommendations that we're arriving at. We'll talk about recommendations for traffic with respect to not only the manner in which the cars move, one-way versus two-way, but we'll also talk about operations at particular intersections. We'll also then give recommendations for what we call complete streets. We'll talk about what that term is. Likely a lot of you are familiar with that already, but we'll give recommendations for what that could look like on 3rd and 4th Streets, and we'll wrap up by talking about final steps. We hope to kind of keep this fairly brief this evening, probably about a 30 to 40 minute presentation. We're going to hang out on the line until 8 o'clock or so here afterwards so that you can continue to participate with us. So there are a couple of different ways in which we would like for you to give us your feedback, your input on the ideas and the content in this presentation. The first way to do that would be to email any questions or comments to Aaron Kowalski. Aaron is an urban planner with MKSK Studios, and Aaron would be able to sort of gather all the questions and comments that we get this evening and answer them. His email address is up on the screen. It's akowalski@mkskstudios, that's plural, .com. Another way you can participate this evening is through the Zoom app itself. There is a Q&A feature built into the app. I'm sure by now most of you are familiar with that, but if you're not, simply hover over the bottom of your screen, and as you do that, you'll be able to see a Q&A button. If you pop open that dialog box, you'll be able to submit a question. Again, if you'd like to provide your email address, we would be able to collect your email address and collect your question and give you an answer directly as we answer all questions. So that's another way you can participate this evening in terms of giving us your feedback and your input, or if you'd like to learn a little bit more about the project. Please continue to track the project. You might have learned about this project through the news or maybe the city's Facebook page. If you did through the city's Facebook page, that this opportunity tonight is posted under the event page, under the 3rd and 4th Street conversion event page. That's where some of you may have learned about this evening's meeting. you will also be able to, through that same portal, see the answers to the questions and comments submitted tonight. So you'll also, not only will you be able to see your question, but all the others that are provided and given this evening, such that you get the benefit of understanding more detail through the questions or comments that other people have made. Another way that you can also learn about the questions or comments submitted this evening is through the city's economic development webpage. You see the URL at the top. You can simply navigate to the economic development portal, which is under business and development on the city's website. And through that link, once you arrive at the economic development page, you would be able to see the orange bar on the web page. It's called Quick Links. Simply click on that and you'll be able to then view the 3rd and 4th Street project and the content. Not only the questions and answers, but also this presentation. We want to make sure that folks have an opportunity to view this presentation after this evening. And so you'll have multiple opportunities to look at the content. So hopefully you're able to take advantage of those different ways in which you can participate this evening, either through the Zoom portal or through the website and the Facebook page. So now we want to sort of transition a little bit and talk about the project purpose in the background. If you've tracked with us before, you're familiar with the limits of what we're studying. We are studying both 3rd and 4th Streets through downtown Lafayette. And particularly, we're looking at the possibility of converting those 2 streets from one-way transportation patterns to 2-way patterns on both streets, such that you'll get cars going both north and south on 3rd and 4th Streets. The study area that we're looking at starts on the south side of town at Alabama and extends all the way up to Union Street on the north side. We're looking at not only the corridors in terms of transportation, but also the sidewalks and integrating other modes of transportation beyond the vehicle. Why are we studying this potential conversion? We're looking at this because of a couple of reasons. We're going to be understanding through this study the feasibility of converting. What we mean by that is, from a traffic perspective, are the streets sized appropriately to accommodate 2-way traffic if a conversion were to occur? And we'll talk about the data behind that, which would point to the possibility of converting from a traffic perspective. We also need to understand how the street would tie back into the network, both 3rd and 4th Street, how they would tie back into the network down at Alabama and up at Union. Of course, Alabama is a little more simple because it's within the grid of the downtown. When we look at tying 3rd and 4th Streets in a 2-way pattern up at Union Street, it's more complicated because of the lack of a grid in that area. So we'll show you some conceptual configurations for how that can occur. And then we'll also talk about placemaking opportunities and complete streets, integrating all kinds of things on these streets to support businesses and support the downtown vibrancy. And we'll touch upon that quite extensively. As we began to think about these corridors, of course, we wanted to understand the benefits and why we would consider converting 2-way streets in downtown environments. And there are lots of great reasons to consider this. It isn't always practical. What makes it practical in our situation is that 3rd and 4th Streets are no longer state highways. For those of you who have been in the community a long time, you likely know that at one point, 3rd and 4th Streets were part of the state highway network. It's been some time now, but they were relinquished back to the city as local streets, and the state highway designations were moved to other corridors. Teal Road and the new bypass are examples of that. And with that change, a lot of the traffic, the through traffic that was going through downtown Lafayette but not stopping in downtown Lafayette is now on the new highway designations of the new streets and highways that have been designated by NDOT. With that, there's been a reduction in traffic on both 3rd and 4th streets, and most of the traffic is actually locally based and local serving. So they're coming to downtown as destination. They're not necessarily moving through Lafayette, going to another part of the state. A lot of that traffic is now on state highways. So we think about converting former highways like those in downtown Lafayette to two-way streets when they can support great downtown vibrancy. And usually what we see when those kinds of conversions happen in Main Street is a great example of this here in downtown Lafayette. We see slower and safer traffic speeds. We see reduced confusion for drivers. And a lot of that is because drivers have more options at intersections. They can maneuver and go left and right without having to circle the block once or twice to get to their destination because the one-way street sort of takes them out of their way. Usually we see easier access to businesses in residential areas because, again, more choices are built into a two-way network, and it's less confusing. Because there's less sort of circumventing the network, there's obviously less vehicle miles traveled cumulatively. And all this results in a safer environment and a more livable environment for a downtown situation. And again, Main Street's a great example of all these things, but most notably the kinds of developments that have occurred along the corridor since it was converted from a one-way pattern to a two-way pattern. A lot of new development, a lot of new businesses at the ground floor and on the upper floors of the historic buildings along Main Street. So a lot of times other communities actually point to the success of this conversion in downtown Lafayette as a great example of the benefits of converting one-way streets into two-way streets. And so, of course, downtown Lafayette and Main Street is a great example. Here you can sort of see different eras of the street. And when it was a one-way pattern, it was actually a one-way couplet with Columbia Street. And since Columbia and South are now the one-way couplets after the conversion. But the vibrancy of downtown and particularly Main Street is really notable and remarkable, not only for us in this community, but for others who observe these things around the state. So the history of these two streets, just to sort of set the table for what we're talking about, 3rd and 4th streets are both primary corridors, obviously, through downtown Lafayette. And it wasn't, they weren't always two-way streets, or I'm sorry, they weren't always one-way streets. Back in the 60s, they were designated state highways, but prior to the 60s, you can see some of the historic photos of these two corridors, which included parking, both angled parking as well as parallel parking. At one time, there was trolley systems running down the streets, and obviously a great sense of vibrancy with businesses and quite a lot of density in downtown Lafayette. Luckily, these two corridors are still sort of occupied in a great fashion with businesses, but the one-way traffic does sort of influence how fast speeds are through these two corridors and the sense of safety and the ability to integrate other things. So as we think about the future of these two streets, we often look back to the past for some guidance, and there certainly was a lot of opportunity and possibility in the past that we see here. So before we get into the content of what we are seeing on the project, I want to talk a little bit about the process. And I should mention at the top here, we are part of a group that has been hired by the city to not only undertake this study, but also to engage with the community. And we'll talk about the different ways in which we're engaging with the community in just a moment. Two firms are responsible for the study. American Structure Point is the lead engineer on the project, and they are primarily focusing on the traffic aspects, the intersections, the control of intersections, and the way in which traffic moves through the two corridors, and the impact that a potential conversion could have on traffic in general. MKSK, we are an urban planning and design firm, and we are leading the engagement process with the community. We're also looking at the opportunities to integrate different modes of transportation and different ways to utilize space along the sidewalks. And together we're, as I mentioned, working through the city on this project. My name is Eric Lucas, and we have and I'm with MKSK. We have a whole host of participants, not only from the design side and the engineering side of the project, but also from the city side as well on this Zoom call. What we've been doing through this study is looking at a number of different aspects of the corridors. We've started the work back in March of this year, and we're going to be wrapping up in July. And we have sort of worked through the process in 3 steps. The first step of our work involved gathering a lot of information and analyzing a lot of information with respect to traffic, parking, sidewalks, etc. And we did traffic counts. Now I should note, we conducted the traffic counts prior to this stay at home or shelter in place orders that were given by the governor. So the traffic counts, and we actually conducted traffic counts prior to Purdue's spring break as well. So they were traffic counts that would be resembling normal conditions here in downtown Lafayette. And that really served as the basis for the considerations that you'll see in a moment with respect to the traffic implications to converting the streets from one-way to two-way. Along the way, our next step, we looked at different alternatives, different cross sections. By that, what we mean is how could we look at the right-of-way between buildings, more or less. The rights-of-way vary on 3rd and 4th Streets. Some areas are a little narrower than others, but generally speaking, they're constrained. And one of the goals of this project is to stay within the rights-of-way, not to expand the rights-of-way. So we looked at different ways in which we could utilize that space for different purposes. We also have been studying different ways in which we can connect back up to Union Street, and also different ways to tie into areas around the courthouse and areas by the city bus depot. And lastly, we've looked at ways in which we could activate sidewalks with permanent and short-term ideas, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Lastly, we've looked at the feasibility of these concepts with respect to utilities and with respect to how these things could be phased. As you probably know, quite a bit of streetscape in downtown Lafayette has been constructed recently, a lot of that on Main Street, but a fair amount also on 3rd and 4th Street. So we absolutely don't want to go back and redo that. So we've been thinking about these alternatives and refining them and understanding how to work within the existing streetscape that has already been improved and continues to be improved. All along the way, we've been engaging with the community. So this is our 2nd public meeting. We held our first public meeting back in April. And in addition to the public meetings, we've conducted stakeholder sessions. By that, what we mean is we've invited business owners and property owners along the corridors to attend a series of sessions and give us their input and their thoughts. And those have been very helpful. And also, we've been working with a group from the city as our project steering committee to guide us along the way. Folks that are representative of the Economic Development Department, engineering, multimodal and pedestrian and biking coordination, and others to help us understand the bigger picture and how every aspect of the project needs to coordinate. So we're at this end point here where we're developing final recommendations, which we'll talk about here in a moment, which should wrap up in July. That'll give you all an opportunity to this evening learn about the project, but then see our final draft document and be able to comment on that draft document. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So with that, I'm going to now transition into the actual content of the presentation, where we talk about, is this possible to convert the 2 streets from one-way to two-way? What does it mean from a traffic perspective? And then what would it mean from a complete streets perspective? And to sort of start off, I'm going to invite Tom Vandenberg with American Structure Point to talk a little bit about the implications from a traffic perspective. Tom?
Thank you, Eric. And everybody hear me? You give me a thumbs up, Eric.
Yes.
Okay, good. So as Eric had mentioned, we collected traffic before the shelter in place, traffic data, and we wanted to get a good cross section. You know, it's not really necessary to collect data at every single intersection, but we did collect them at all the major intersections there, 14 of them. And we collect, you know, the weekday, the typical weekday AM and PM peak hour traffic, you know, the what you might call the rush hours, the commuting hours. And not only that, but from that, we can also look at the 24-hour data along the roadway segments. And that's what I'm showing here, showing the information at a high level for everyone. And on the left is the existing traffic volumes. And in the boxes are what's called the ADTs. That stands for average daily traffic. And what that means is that's the typical weekday 24-hour traffic volume. And one of the reasons why I show this on this graphic is there's a general rule of thumb that roughly 12,000 to 17,000 ADT, that type of ADT can be accommodated by a two-lane, two-way road. So that means two-way direction with one lane in each direction. So you can see the existing ADTs along the roads, both 4th Street and 3rd Street. They're roughly 4,000 to 7,000 ADT, give or take, a couple hundred, if you will. So that's well within that threshold of, you know, if we were to convert these to two-way, one lane in each direction, they'll be able to accommodate that. Because again, it's 12,000 to 17,000 ADT that a two-lane, two-way road can handle. So from the existing traffic, we made some assumptions as to how that would get redistributed. We kind of assumed that there'd probably be more traffic that would redistribute from 3rd Street going south to then go south on 4th Street. And there'd be a little bit less traffic, but there would still be some that is going north on 4th that would redistribute to 3rd. So on the right-hand side of the screen, that's our estimate of the redistributed traffic volumes. Again, this is just kind of what we thought would redistribute locally when these are converted to two-way. One of the things that will probably happen to some degree is traffic will probably redistribute from 9th Street over to 4th Street. 9th Street has roughly about 12,000 ADT. And if that does happen, you can see there the redistributed traffic on 4th Street, roughly 7,300 cars. Again, that's roughly 5,000 ADT that we've got cushion, if you will. So if some traffic from 9th Street does redistribute over to 4th, you know, it's going to be able to handle it. The other thing that we looked at is each of the intersections. We looked at the number of lanes that we need, left turn lanes and right turn lanes. I'm not going to go into detail of that. Nick is going to go into some of those at some of the key intersections here in a minute. We also looked at the traffic control at each of these intersections. Specifically Ferry and Main on 3rd and 4th, those are currently traffic signals. We anticipate that day one, what we mean by day one or any initial projects, when this gets converted to two-way traffic day one, we would recommend that probably the traffic signals at Ferry and Main at 3rd Street can most likely be removed. They're really unnecessary now as far as the traffic volume is concerned. But right now we kind of have this one-way pair on 3rd and 4th, so it works well with the traffic signal system. But once they get converted to two-way traffic, we would anticipate intersections 3 and 4 there on 3rd Street at Ferry and Main. Those can be downgraded, if you will, from a traffic signal control to most likely an always stop control. Because again, we have pedestrians at those intersections, so we want to make sure that they're safe. Day one, converting to two-way, we would recommend that the traffic signals at Ferry and Main on 4th Street, which is intersections 10 and 11, we would recommend that those remain as traffic signals. You can see there's going to be a little bit more traffic on 4th than there currently is today, and there's definitely going to be more on 4th than there is on 3rd. So we would suggest let's leave those as traffic signals, and then let's sort of monitor those over time. And if it makes sense to remove those as traffic signals, then maybe we might do that later. If you can remember, a couple of traffic signals on Main Street, a couple of intersections on Main Street used to be traffic signals, and they were downgraded to stop signs. So that's not an uncommon thing. Finally, what I want to mention is we would recommend the traffic signals along Columbia and South, obviously, to remain, because the one-way pair system of Columbia and South will still remain as part of this project. So now I'm going to turn it over to Nick, who's going to talk about some of these key intersections. Nick?
Thank you, Tom. My name is Nick Murphy with American Structure Point. I'm a road engineer, and thank you for joining us tonight. If you were with us for the last presentation, you probably remember what looked like sketches on the aerial, and what we've got tonight is further developed concepts. These are feasibility concepts, as Eric mentioned earlier, so keep in mind, none of this is definitive and is always subject to change, but these are concepts that we've vetted out and, you know, would further continue to develop in a final design phase. But starting at the north end of the project there near the Union Street intersection, and you'll see the blow up to the right. If you were headed down 3rd, you would have the option today to move east to Union Street, but with this concept, which we're calling a low impact or initial phase rollout, with the idea being that you could do this quickly without great disruption to the existing infrastructure, cost effectively, you would now have the option to make a right turn and continue south along 4th Street, as opposed to having to continue along 3rd in order to head south. If you did continue south along existing 3rd, as it's configured today towards Cincinnati, you'll see there is an option to make a left turn at Cincinnati and head east, or continue straight down 3rd Street. Cincinnati is really the kind of the transition or gateway point for 3rd and 4th, in order to tie that existing single one-way infrastructure north to the new two-way road infrastructure to the south. And you will notice on the exhibits that we're showing some sharrows with parallel parking. That's part of, you know, the complete streets approach we're taking, and there's other options definitely to consider there, which Eric's going to get into a little bit more. But for consistency's sake, all these concepts that we further developed show sharrows with parallel parking. As we continue on, you know, here's just kind of a zoom in, if you will, around Cincinnati Street. I want to point out, you know, 3rd Street, south of Cincinnati, you would be required to make a right turn to Cincinnati in order to move north or east. This is a zoom in again up near the Union Street interchange, and really not a whole lot of changes from what's there today, other than having the option to continue south from 3rd. Union Street would remain one way to the east. And it's not shown on the graphic, but near Wall Street, there's likely the concept would be to just keep a right turn only in the rightmost lane if you're heading north along 4th, or if you wanted to continue north on 4th, you could do so by staying in the lane closest to the center line. So kind of a different approach at the Union interchange would be to look at, you know, long-term options and non-low impact options to really maximize mobility and safety for all users in this area. And so what you see is that, you know, a roundabout concept. So kind of walking through the vehicular movements through this, if you were headed south on 3rd, you would have the option to continue south or take the roundabout, which is a nice smooth transition down to southbound 4th Street. If you're moving north on 4th Street, you would have the option to continue to Union, just like you do today, or traverse through the roundabout and continue up 4th Street. You know, the roundabout has a lot of safety benefits, as well as you know, reducing speeds through this intersection. So there's a lot of positives that could come from implementing a roundabout in this location. But again, that's just one concept. that we've developed and, would be further vetted during a final design.
There's one clarification here too. This actually connects up to Fannin Drive to the north, which is obviously a two-way network. So,
yeah, good point, Eric. Thank you. So during some of our public outreach during the project, we've heard questions and concerns about the area around the city bus depot, particularly related to pedestrian crossings and visibility. So we looked at a concept to try and reduce those pedestrian crossing distances. So on the top of the graphic, you'll see we're showing bump outs, which would increase visibility for pedestrians as well as shorten that pedestrian crossing. And then you'll also notice on the east side of 3rd, there's some bump outs with some parallel parking spaces shown. And another key point is today with 3rd Street just being one way, the flow for the bank is different than what it would need to be for a 2-lane facility. So we've bumped out the curb there in a couple locations to make that a feasible movement in the future. And on the left side of 3rd Street or the west, there's additional pavement area, much like what exists today, to allow the buses to make all the movements they need to get in and out of the depot safely, because obviously they're large vehicles and require a little bit of extra space. And at the south end of the project, near Alabama Street, again, Alabama would remain 2-way, much as it does today, maintaining that right turn lane that exists from eastbound to southbound 4th. On the north side of Alabama, you'll see, again, that same 2-way configuration with sharrows and parallel parking. But again, those sharrows and parallel parking spots are part of the complete streets discussion, which Eric's going to jump into now.
all right, thank you, Nick. And we're kind of rounding out the presentation for the evening. We wanted to kind of highlight the opportunity here to think about a complete street. And for those who maybe aren't as familiar with that terminology, a complete street is really what we refer to as streets for everyone. And that includes pedestrians and motorists and bicyclists, but also the people who have businesses along the street, maybe people who live above the businesses or have offices above the businesses. So a street contains a lot of different amenities or elements if it's a complete street. And Main Street is a terrific example of this. To keep going back to the Main Street example, but along Main Street, what you see are bump outs, which Nick just talked about. These bump outs are very, very helpful to reducing the crossing distance for a pedestrian. They also really help to calm traffic from a higher speed down to a lower speed. And they protect parallel parked cars as well. You also see wider sidewalks in complete streets, and those accommodate different things like trash receptacles and bike racks, benches, even public art and street trees. And so Main Street has all of those components. And in addition to accommodating wider sidewalks and pedestrians and the cars in 2 directions, we see on Main Street sharrows. Sharrows are designations painted onto the pavement that let motorists and bicyclists know that this is a shared space, that bicyclists have the opportunity to share this space, and that motorists need to be more aware of the cyclists within the travel lanes. The last thing we see typically here is a really active and an intentional activation of ground floor space. So not only do we see bump outs at intersections, we also see bump outs at restaurants. Those are very, very helpful to giving additional space for dining establishments outdoors, which in today's situation is even more critical than ever. But allows that merchant to extend its available square footage to the sidewalk and populate that area with dining tables and chairs, all of which add a really strong sense of vibrancy and vitality and liveliness to the street. Main Street is a classic example of this. So on our project, we see a couple of opportunities. Really, by and large, we want to sort of continue to grow that sense of liveliness from Main Street onto 3rd and 4th. And it does exist in some places of 3rd and 4th already. But what we think could be possible even right now, if we were to convert the street to two-way traffic, we could retain parking on both sides. We could integrate sharrows. We could provide bump outs, permanent bump outs when streetscape is redone, or if it already is redone, we can provide permanent bump outs in certain places for outdoor dining. Where a streetscape isn't already completed, we would be able to provide temporary spaces for outdoor dining, parklets, as we call them, which really take the place of a parking space or two. It allows, again, outdoor dining for the adjacent restaurant. So all of these items could be potential right now with the conversion of the street. We have enough space for this, and we would be able to integrate all these different amenities along the sidewalks. And this is possible not only on 3rd Street, but it's also possible on 4th Street. So both corridors, if converted, could function quite a bit like Main Street does already, with the different modes of transportation and the focus on outdoor dining and wider sidewalks, where the streetscape has already been redone. And when the streetscape is rebuilt, we can build it to fit within this concept, so that the available space for parking and bikes and cars is preserved in the long term. Now, one thing that we've studied extensively throughout the project is the opportunity to integrate a more robust bike network along the corridors. We've studied this fairly exhaustively, and we've looked at numerous different ways to do this on both corridors or potentially on just one of the corridors. And one thing that we feel is worth additional study is the 4th Street corridor, and being able to integrate bike lanes on the corridor. Sharrows are one way in which we can integrate bicycles within the street network. Typically, people who are comfortable in sharrow conditions are more experienced bike riders. We often see, when we look at integrating dedicated bike lanes, as you see in this image, we often see maybe more bikers willing to utilize the streets because there is a dedicated space for them. So you not only get the very experienced bikers, but you get the more casual bikers, those who would love to come downtown and spend time in stores or restaurants, but maybe aren't as confident on their bike. They would likely try that if there were dedicated bike lanes. So we're very intrigued by the opportunity to integrate bike lanes on one of the corridors. And 4th Street is a great corridor. The city is already looking at integrating additional bike infrastructure south of Alabama on 4th Street that would tie all the way to Poland Hill. And this would be an extension of that network of bike infrastructure along 4th Street. Now, one of the things that we've pointed out here at the top of the slide, this is pending further analysis of the parking utilization. So in order to achieve what you see on the screen here, which is one 4-foot bike lane on the west curb, which would be southbound travel, and one 4-foot bike lane plus a 2-foot buffer on the northbound side of the street. In order to accommodate this, of course, we would need to remove parking off of the west curb line. The west curb line in certain places doesn't have a lot of parking. In other places, only one curb has parking. and we would flip that to the east. And then in certain places, there's a good amount of off-street parking provided at businesses on the west side. So we want to be able to further analyze the opportunity to integrate more robust bike lanes through a more detailed utilization study of how that on-street parking is being used today. But certainly this would be possible in the future. It would also be possible now if that analysis turned out to be a positive analysis. We have the available width already in the street to accommodate this pending the analysis of parking utilization. So in terms of complete streets, we know that we can, whether we integrate sharrows or whether we integrate bike lanes, we can really accommodate different modes of transportation. We can provide outdoor dining spaces. We can accommodate parking, as well as street trees, streetscape items like benches and trash receptacles and bike racks, and of course the two-way traffic. So, and this is a visual of what those two different ways to integrate bike infrastructure look like. On the left-hand side, you see the notion of sharrows, markers on the ground or on the pavement that instruct motorists as well as bicyclists that this is a shared space. And then on the right, you see the notion of a bike lane, dedicated bike lane that is separate from the travel lane. And you can also see the buffer. The buffer is very important to protect the bicyclist from a door opening. So if a motorist parks along the curb and they're getting out of their car, they open the door, the buffer actually protects the bicyclist from the car door opening into the bike lane. Without that protection, a bicyclist can be thrown off their bike. So these are the two different ways in which we are contemplating integrating bikes, again, on the right-hand side, pending further analysis of the parking utilization. All of this, of course, will help to promote the vibrancy of downtown. There's been a tremendous amount of development activity, a great amount of businesses relocating into downtown. MKSK is actually one of those businesses recently having relocated to downtown Lafayette. And so with these improvements and with more downtown-oriented streets rather than highways, we are excited about the opportunity to see more growth in our downtown, particularly outside of the core around the Alabama Street area and north of Ferry. All of this, of course, contributes to a downtown that continues to grow and prosper. Lafayette is a bright spot across the state of Indiana and the Midwest, quite frankly. The development activity happening here and the interest in investing in downtown Lafayette is significant, and the quality of place, the investments that the city has already made go to incentivizing that kind of activity and goes to creating a much more livable downtown for all residents. So that takes us to the end of our presentation. I appreciate you hanging with us here for the last 45 minutes or so. We want to wrap up by, first of all, thanking you, but secondly, telling you about our next steps on the project. This is our final public meeting, but beyond today, we will be wrapping up our report, and we will be giving you the opportunity to review that final report, as well as between now and July 10th, we'll continue to take your questions about what you've seen tonight, or maybe what others might see in the days to come online from this presentation. We'll continue to take questions until Friday, July 10th, that's next Friday. And then once we get all the questions from you guys, and we will then compile responses and post them back out to the city's webpage as well as the event page on Facebook. If you provide your email address with your question, we'll be able to directly answer your question back to you through the email. Again, we'll wrap up by assembling a final report, which we are targeting for July. So with that, we hope that you've learned a lot about the project tonight, and hopefully we've been able to answer any questions through the presentation. Should you have more questions or if you've had questions throughout, know that we will be able to get back to you and give answers to every question. And you'll be able to see the benefit. You'll have the benefit of seeing all the answers to questions that others have posed this evening as well. Again, thank you for your time. We would have loved to have done this in person. Getting together is always more interesting and dynamic, but given our current situation, we want to make sure we put safety first for all involved. And with that, in closing, again, I want to say thank you. Hopefully you are able to participate and ask questions and provide input. We look forward to wrapping the project up and looking at next steps afterwards. Appreciate your time. Thank you all.